Hey guys, hope everyone's doing really well today or tonight. I want to make a quick video on three unique ways that I found that you can leverage property. Now, these are ways that aren't, your normal, typical ways that everyone talks about. For example, renting out property, potentially doing short-term leases on Airbnb, maybe taking out equity to grow your wealth. So these aren't those kind of things. These are more niche and interesting things that not many people talk about, and can potentially be used as well, even if you don't have an investment property, but if you have your own property. Now, obviously, and I'll get into this as we go through the video, but speaking to an accountant or a financial advisor will be really important for some of these, because obviously I'm not an expert. Here are some ways that I potentially might in the future utilize property, or I might already be doing. So let's get into it. Now, a really common one that's come about, especially for people in Sydney, is something called rent investing. Now, essentially, what rent investing is instead of purchasing a home to live in Sydney, where it's normally very expensive and hard to just get into the market because it's so competitive at times. Rather than do that, you rent in Sydney and then you purchase elsewhere in Australia. For example, places like Perth, Queensland, Adelaide, maybe even somewhere in Tasmania as well. And then you that becomes an investment property, and that generates income, and that income will offset the rent paid in Sydney. So it's very similar to owning your own home, except it's not in Sydney, and you also get the tax deductions and benefits of having an investment property. And the bonus is as well, you're likely to get somewhere in Sydney that you couldn't afford normally. But because the yields are so low in Sydney, because the property prices are so high, there's an arbitrage opportunity there to kind of rent where you want to really live, and then invest somewhere else where you're able to generate that income and then break even. So it's become really, really popular in recent times. And yeah, I mean, there's no hard rule for how to invest. It's just essentially investing somewhere where the yield will equate to the rent costs for where you want to live. Now, reinvesting is super flexible, and it just means that you're able to enter the property market sooner in a lot of cases. For example, if there's a house in Perth, in a decent suburb, it might end up costing you $600,000. Whereas the equivalent in Sydney might end up costing you 1.2 million or 1.4 million. So there's a big difference. And especially with property prices rising so quickly, there's definitely an opportunity cost to waiting out and waiting to afford that Sydney property versus hopping onto the property ladder in somewhere like Perth, and then you're able to grow potentially even quicker than some of the properties in Sydney. And then one day you might be able to cash out of that property and then put all those that money earned, those capital gains, into a Sydney property if you want to. So it can work really well for some people. Now, if you're not specifically hooked to one location, and you're renting where it's very expensive, this is where it works really well. So places like Sydney, Melbourne, um, potentially potentially some regional towns in New South Wales or Victoria. This works really well. Where it won't work as well is those more the places with really high rental yields. So, for example, far north Queensland. Queensland is getting a little bit trickier, and for example, Perth, the yields are quite good there, which for a rent investor isn't good. You want a low yield to live, and then you want a high yield for where you invest. Now, another consideration for a lot of people is, oh, but I don't get my first home buyer benefits. Now, in a lot of cases, and speak to a professional about this, but what you lose from your first home buyer benefits or your PPOR or owner occupier, residence, what you lose from not taking on those benefits, you'll get back in tax deductions and quicker capital growth and the ability to hop into the market sooner. So, and there's lots of different things you can do with investment properties, which we'll get into in a little bit. But for the right person, it could work really well. Especially if you're a little bit more flexible and open to, investing in other markets which aren't as established as Sydney or Melbourne. Now, another really good option to leverage property would be house hacking. Now, what house hacking is essentially you purchase a property, right, to live in, and you might have a family of 3 people, and you end up buying a 4 bedroom house, or you might have a 3 bedroom house with a garage. Now, what you could do with this is you essentially in your house you essentially have a space that could be rented out, almost like a partial investment property. So this can work really well, especially if you're struggling to pay the mortgage. Renting out that space for say $200 or $300 a week could make a really big difference in terms of paying back your mortgage. $250 a week ends up being $1,000 per month of rental income, and that can go straight towards the mortgage. So really great. Now, there are a mix of PPOR or owner occupied homes and investment benefits based on the split. So, and again, talk to an accountant about this, but obviously, with your home, if you've met certain conditions, you can sell that and not pay any tax on the growth of the home. But if you have a portion of your home, say 20% of your home, and that's being rented out, then you can roughly allocate 20% towards investment costs. So like any costs with investment properties will be assigned to that portion, and then the rest will just be a normal house with it without capital gains. And yeah, like I've said here, you could potentially convert a garage or a basement into a bedroom. That could work really well as well. If you and this all works if you're okay with having people live with you. Personally, I wouldn't mind it if I find the right person. Especially if I'm living alone at the time. Now, what's really interesting as well, which not many people would consider with this, but you could potentially purchase more house with this strategy, which means if you're only able to afford a 3 bedroom home, if you can kind of structure it in a way that it's it's a 3 bedroom plus a portion of that will be rented out, you might actually be able to get a bigger loan from the bank because they see that this is actually partially for investment. Now, this might not work in all situations, but it could be an idea in terms of being able to grow your borrowing power without adjusting, or I guess adjusting your situation or earning more or anything like that. So it could be really good. Now, here's another one as well. A work from home or office setup in your own personal home. So the obvious things here, right? If you own your own business or you're an employee who works from home a lot of the time, I mean, it saves you from renting an office or a workspace, and those costs can be tax deducted, right? So, obviously, this wouldn't be your entire house, but a portion that's used for work or business, for example, gas, internet, furniture, things of this nature, can be tax deducted against your income, and that kind of, in a way, makes it so that your home, partially built for business, is partially tax deductible and partially, in a good situation to leverage your own home. Now, there are some circumstances as well where occupancy expenses, so for example, mortgage interest, is also covered. Speak to an accountant, but this could be massive if you're able to tax deduct those interest expenses like an investment property. Now, what's really interesting as well is that your company could even rent a spot in your house and pay you rent. Now, I've said here it needs to be legit, and by that I mean it needs to be, all across board. It needs to be a fair market rate. It can't be anything dodgy. It needs to be legit, and that everything's set up to do your business work, and it's all above board. So this could be really interesting as well. Now, another option is similar to another consideration, sorry, is similar to house hacking. You may remove some of the PPOR benefits, right? And that's kind of like, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, the no capital gains will be lifted from that portion of the property. So just keep that in mind. You might get back all the investment and tax benefits, but you will lose potentially on that capital gains exemption for that portion of the house. Now, I'll end with this, right? It can get super complicated. It's I'm not a financial expert, so make sure you speak to someone or do some research yourself before you implement any of these things. Probably better to speak to an expert, but if you feel comfortable trying some of these things yourself, go for it. I think these are really underrated ways to leverage property, and including property that you own currently, and you kind of it's not generating income. It's not none of the interest is tax deductible, and it's kind of just draining you every single week. So this could be really interesting. So yeah, hopefully you guys have found some value in this, and yeah, here are 3 ways that you can leverage property that aren't so obvious to everyone. If you guys have any questions, make sure to let me know down below. But otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.